Okay.
I think it's very, very important because, yeah, because we know there's nothing more important than sacral things and to make sacral things public.
Definitely. So Anna, you said that we have a couple more people that we're waiting on.
Yes, but I think that Marina is over here, so Troy is not joining. We can actually start, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Should we do a quick round of introductions or?
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I can start with myself. My name is Nick. I'm the kind of the curator of conceptual development of Bабin Yaru, also the kind of organizer of the architecture board / working group.
Robert Jan van Pelt. I originally come from the Netherlands, but I'm a Canadian now. I teach cultural history at an architecture school at the University of Waterloo, which is near Toronto. And I'm speaking from Toronto.
Maybe me, Ines. I was recently a professor of architecture history and theory at the Bauhaus University in Weimar. I'm based in London now, and I run the PhD program at the School of Architecture at the RCA, the Royal College of Art in London. And I also run the Center for Documentary Architecture, which is a research collective where we do documentary films, online archives, and exhibitions, and maybe there's an expertise that could be relevant for this project.
Okay, I'm Marina. I'm an architect and I live in the Netherlands. I'm director of research at the New Institute, that is a national institution of architecture, design, and digital culture in the Netherlands. And I also direct the Masters of Social Design in the Design Academy in Leuven. And today I'm a bit like not feeling very well, so that's why I'm a bit in the dark.
It's okay, totally okay. And so missing from this group of the working group is Troy Conrad-Terrian, who is currently the curator of architecture and digital initiatives at the Guggenheim Museum, but he is absent today. And so it looks like the person, Anna, who you introduced from the foundation is no longer connected, but there's still Oleg here.
Oleg Shavenko, would you like to introduce us?
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm without video because I'm feeling a bit ill. I got the coronavirus actually. Maybe not yet. So I'm head of the publishing project, library project, and co-curator of collection of the museum. Nice to meet you, everybody.
Yeah, nice to meet you too.
Get healthy again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My name is Ilya Khrzhanovsky. I'm a teaching director of Babin Yaru Holocaust Memorial Center. And I'm very happy that we have possibility in this strange time to discuss things which is always important, like sacral things. And thank you for everyone to keep interest to work on this project and to do things what they're doing.
Anna, do you want to round
up? Yeah, so I'm director for conceptual development and research projects at the foundation, and I'm happy to join this presentation that we are all looking forward from Robert on sacral things in Jewish tradition.
Yeah, so Robert Jan, thank you for kicking this off, these series of presentations. I have enabled sharing screen. I've been working with Robert Jan on this presentation over the past few months, and I am past few weeks, and I'm very excited to hear the presentation. So yeah, thank you, Robert Jan, and please take us away.
Okay, so thank you, Nick. So what I'm going to do is a little bit of a boot camp. It's basically Jewish Space Boot Camp, and it's a walk through history in 120 slides. Basically, there's 3 groups of 40 slides. So the first one is about basically the biblical Hebrew tradition. We really only talk about Jews after the Babylonian exile, up to the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era. The second part is about basically Jewish space during exile. That is from 70 CE to more or less today. And of course, if you're a Zionist, you would say, you know, exile stopped in 1948, but we're not going to go there. And the third bit, I call the road to Babin Yaru. And we'll see how far we go today. If any moment you want to interrupt and ask a question, feel free to do so. So it's called right now Jewish Space from Bereshit Today. Bereshit, of course, Hebrew from in the beginning, or to be precise, in the beginning of. So we begin from place to space, and I start with my favorite thinker, Goethe, who said that if you really want to have bearings on anything, you need to take a 3,000-year perspective. And in this case, 3,000 years brings us actually to the construction, exactly 1,000 before Common Era of the Temple of Jerusalem, if it really ever existed, but another 2,000 years will add to it to go to ancient Sumeria. Second person for this particular presentation who inspires me is, of course, Walter Benjamin, who says that history ultimately condenses stories, get condensed in images. And so this is why the image in this presentation is absolutely central. So this actually is a drawing that I made in 1981 for my then dissertation. I did it, I cut it all from little, you know, cellophanes for stuff like that. My doctoral dissertation was on cosmic speculations on the Temple of Jerusalem. And you see basically here a modified version of illustrations that existed already in the 1980s about the Middle Eastern worldview, as it was popular among Sumerians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Canaanites, and even Hebrews originally. That is, that there is kind of the waters above and the waters below, and God separates them in the Genesis from each other. So below us are also waters, which becomes clear when, of course, you dig a hole and you come to the groundwater. And that the sky is supported by columns at the end of the world. But the important modification is that actually the sky touches down in the holy place while the underworld comes up. So that any holy place, like for example, the city of Jerusalem, the place of the Dome of the Rock, but it could be also any Sumerian or Babylonian holy place, is actually a place which is not only a center in the world taken as a flat pancake, but also in a vertical sense. That literally the 3 realms of heaven, earth, and underworld are tied together in a place like that. And this is why any modification, any manipulation of such a holy place has such incredible cosmic consequences. So, and this is a reconstruction that goes back both to Babylonian and Sumerian legends, but even to Jewish traditions. So I then introduce a very famous kind of hymn, which was created in the city of Nippur or Nibru, or known as Enlil city. And this talks about the philosophy of the Middle Eastern temple in Sumerian times, that is in what's today Mesopotamia in Iraq, around 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. And that basically is that the god is living on this mountain, even if the mountain doesn't seem to be that high anymore when it's located in the center of a city. But that, and it talks about at Nibru, the lofty bond between heaven and earth. So again, it is this idea of a knot, of literally a place of connection. And that, but it's not only that he is in that he is, you know, the shining temple, the lofty dwelling, yeah? It reaches up to heaven, yeah? Which means it's very literal in this case, yeah? A crenellation reaches up to the midst of heaven. And of course, we will come later back to the myth of the Tower of Babel. So here we have a picture of the city reconstruction of the city of Eridu. And what's very important to realize is that every city that had a center in some way shared in that idea of being the center, simultaneously local and universal. So while in some way this idea of Enlil's mountain existed in Nippur, but also the city of Eridu, which is not that far from it, could make the same claim. So it isn't an either-or situation in these times, in these mythic times, but you can have that kind of navel, that knot, that point of meeting at any given place, and it is real for the citizens of that city. So this means then that we really need to start thinking about these strange relationships between these different places that exist. Now, a very famous example, of which, of course, we have still the remains or the reconstructed remains of such a city, is Ur. And there is a ziggurat, the ziggurat that has been restored over the past 100 years. We see again a visualization of the city of Ur, which again had a great mountain Enlil there. And this is again the navel of the universe. But what makes Ur very interesting in our talk is that, of course, the Bible talks about a man who is willing to leave Ur, who is called by God. That is the story that is told. A man named Abraham, and he basically engages in what's a very dangerous and lethal kind of act. That is to leave the center to go to the periphery. Now we know from the Gilgamesh epos that Gilgamesh and Enkidu leave Uruk, which is the center, in order to go to the forest in Lebanon to get wood, but they come back. That means they always, whenever they have an adventure, they leave the center with the intention of returning there. But what is interesting about the story that is in the book of Genesis about this man Abraham is that he leaves the center with the intention of never to return, that he goes to a land that's far away, that he doesn't know, and where he actually, according to this story, and it's written later, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. So it's very interesting that now in some way there is a spatial separation is demanded of Abraham, but there is going to be a temporal reward. That is, he will be a great nation in the future. Yeah. So already we see in this text that there is a certain shift of thinking. And in fact, the text is from the 7th century. Now, we find this in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. And the tradition is that it was written by Moses at Mount Sinai. And if you ask any Orthodox Jew or Christian, they will tell you that is exactly how they believe the book was created. On the basis of forensic analysis, which has been going on for the past 200 years, we know actually that the very complex mosaic of many textual strands, one of them, the oldest one, is identified as E because God is called El in them. And this would be a textual narrative that actually comes from what is today Samaria in Palestine. Then there is a second narrative called J, which actually comes from the south, from Judea, south of Jerusalem. And then 2 other major narratives, P and D. P, which was created during the 7th century, and D during the 6th century. And that it is these different strands that basically are united in a single text, which we know as the Torah, the books of Moses, in the 5th century only. So this is the assumption I'm going to work with. There are scholars who have, they would disagree with me on details, but basically this is the biblical kind of scholarship that is taught in Harvard, in the Harvard Divinity School, for example. Now, when Abram went to Canaan, the Canaanites had also sacred places. And the most important god in the Canaanite pantheon was a god called El, which is translated in the Bible as God. So whenever the Lord or God, whenever you see that name, that is basically El in English. And El basically is a root, and you find it also in the names of other gods, other manifestations of El. Baal, of course, being the most famous of it. In Jerusalem, there was a god called El Elyon, which is mostly translated as God Most High. What's interesting of El is that there are these local Canaanite sanctuaries in Canaan, which is today Israel, Palestine, but that El is supposed to live on Mount Zaphon, which really is Jebel Akra, which is actually a mountain in Syria, close to the Turkish border on the Mediterranean. So he lives there, like Enlil lives, you know, on one sacred mountain, but then his local manifestations in Canaan relate back to that kind of general presence of El on Mount Zaphon. Now, the sanctuary that's going to be most important in our story is actually the city of Jerusalem. And that was a Canaanite city. It was actually the only Canaanite city that still existed around year 1000 CE as an independent city. All the other cities had been conquered by the Hebrew tribes. And what's interesting is that it had this rock formation on the north side of the city, which is right now the Temple Mount. And there is this weird rock there, which is identified as the navel of the earth, the Eben Shatia, the foundation stone of the earth, the place where, according to Jewish traditions, God created this stone and threw it literally in the void, creating the world. And this is an interesting 19th century painting of the dome of the rock, which frames that rock. And what you see actually that through this baldachin that's hanging over the rock, it actually suggests in its spatiality, this coming together of a world from below and this idea of the sky above it, which of course is also symbolized by the dome of the rock. So it's an incredibly powerful place in the Canaanite tradition, and that legend, that sense of it being the navel of the earth was preserved later in the Jewish and Muslim traditions. This is the place where Muhammad is supposed to have begun his journey to the heavens. Of course, the Christian tradition has just moved this tradition over to Gethsemane, to the place where Christ is buried. So it moved it around 500 meters from this site. So this is according to Jewish traditions. We don't really have any Canaanite text. This is the center of the world in the sense of the world as a geography, but it is also it's a center of history, because Jewish traditions say that this is the place where God creates Adam, so it's the beginning of human history. This is the place also where Abraham, who's become Abraham after his covenant with God is made in Canaan, basically obeys God's command to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. This, of course, is an incredible difficult moment, because God had promised Abraham that he would have all these kids and these grandkids, and then you have only one son, and Abraham is 120 years old, and then you ask the son to be sacrificed. It's a contradiction, but Abraham basically passes this test of faith, and this is also the place where then the Holy of Holies will be created. Again, it's that knot where heaven, earth, and underworld come together. So what happens is that many of these stories about Abraham, also about Isaac and about Jacob and his sons, who then become 12 sons, become 12 tribes, they go to Egypt, they come back in the Exodus. More or less, we accept today that that's mythology. These are legends, that there is no evidence in history really to prove that this really happened. What we do know, however, is the following, which is a basis again of this forensic analysis of especially the language and narrative strands of the Bible, that around 3,000 years ago, around the year 1000, which was very convenient, there were two, basically, there was a tribe to the south of Jerusalem, Jerusalem being a Canaanite city-state, independent, the Jebusite in a city-state, that there was Judea to the south, which has its capital Hebron, and this was one quite powerful Hebrew tribe, a warlike tribe, and then a pastoral tribe, so they were into herding, and to the north of it was a collection of Hebrew tribes, maybe one, maybe more, certainly not 10, as tradition later says, in the area of Samaria today. So think about Nablus, think about the Ramallah, and to the north of it, And this was an agricultural society. So these societies have a different economy. They also have a different relationship to the land as a result. So what happens is that these two societies have two heroes. They have two founding fathers. The founding father of the Judahites is a man called Aaron, and the founding father of the Israelites to the north, because it's called Israel, is Moses. So originally two different characters from two different traditions who are later brought together into the narrative of the Exodus as being brothers. That is when these two identities merge. Moses, who basically belongs to the religion of El, which is an Israelite chief god, Aaron, where is another god who becomes very important in the Judahite tradition called Yahweh. He is a war god, and because the Judahites are fighting wars with the Philistines, he becomes very important. That's the god you want to be on your side when you go into war. Now, what David does is he unites basically Judah, Israel in the north, and Jerusalem in a single kingdom. He first becomes king of Judea, then he becomes also king of Israel, and then finally they conquer together Jerusalem and they create a united kingdom there. And now the difficulty is that what David faces is how to unite these different political but also religious traditions in a single official institutional culture in Jerusalem. And Judah and Israel were quite different. They had a kind of common Hebrew memory, but their traditions were very different. Now, if you're looking at the religious architecture that exists at the time in Canaan, in the land, the Eretz Israel, Palestine, whatever you call it, there were temples. These were temples to Baal or El Elyon, but they were rather small. They were really local temples. And so what happens is that when David creates this united kingdom, which is something that's larger than there has been in that area ever before, he needs basically to expand on what actually is the architectural and liturgical language that's available to him. One of the most likely sources was actually a temple that is in Syria, excavated in the 1930s, at Tel Tayunat. Tel is a mount, of course, and this shows a more formal hierarchy of a porch, a sanctuary, and a holy of holies. And this is the kind of form that is adopted for the new temple that's going to be built in Jerusalem. David never gets to it. Probably there is in the Bible evidence of these conflicts between the Judahite and the Israelite kind of priests, but it's only his son Solomon, who was a real son of a bitch, to call it politely. I mean, he was a dictator. He was a kind of real authoritarian character who wasn't shy in eliminating his political opponents, and who ends up murdering the Israelite high priest in order to get the Jerusalemite Canaanite high priest in charge of everything. He basically then is able to push through the construction of a new temple. Now, in that temple, as I said, in that cult, they need to bring together three different traditions. That is the Judahite traditions, which focuses on an object called the Ark of the Covenant. This is related to Yahweh, carried in battle by the Judahites. And so it is a covenant between God and the Judahites as the God, as a warlord, basically. And so whatever is the contract is in that box. The Israelites, which call Moses their ancestor, have another holy object. They have local little temples to El, Baal, but the most important thing is that they have a tent called the Tent of Meeting, which is basically a symbol of the confederation, because it's a confederation of tribes. This is where the elders meet, and it's associated particularly with Moses. Finally, the Canaanite city of Jerusalem, the Jebusite city of Jerusalem, we have not that much information, but we have from other excavations in Canaan, we basically have indications that they used these winged creatures of a lion's body with the wings of an eagle and a human face, which are known as lamassu in Assyria, and which become later known as cherubim in the Hebrew tradition. And these are protective animals, animals that protect basically the house of the god. And so this is my reconstruction, made in 1991, of the Temple of Jerusalem, which actually shows the coming together in the Holy of Holies of the tent of meeting, which is pitched below the basically a platform. The platform itself is lifted up into the clerestory level. So originally the Temple of Solomon, actually the Holy of Holies was not dark, but it was lighted, and I have proof for that from the Psalms. And then in the clerestory level, what you get is two big cherubim, and you get the Ark of the Covenant. So the three, it's kind of a very kind of, transactional, I would say, hypothesis, but basically how these three religious symbols are united in this temple. So, this is a temple of so we basically have El Elyon and Yahweh. All of these gods are basically, in a common household right now. Because of Solomon's horrible rule, dictatorial rule, which basically had really suppressed the Israelites. Solomon was the son of a Canaanite woman, Bathsheba, and a Judahite father. He didn't care about the Israelites. The moment he dies, Israel separates from the united monarchy. So what you remain now with is Judea, but which also includes Jerusalem at its northern border, and Israel that goes separately. And for this moment, I'm only going to really look at what happens to Judea. So Judea is this, pastoral economy still, with this capital, a little bit like Vienna in 1980 Austria. Yeah, so the capital is really too large for this tiny little state. Because now the temple is not anymore connected to Israelite traditions, the Israelite part of the temple content is forgotten. I must assume that the tent of meeting, we have basically evidence that the tent of meeting was brought into the temple, that it at a certain moment was taken out, or it was simply forgotten. It's not important anymore in the later description. And that the cherubim and the Ark of the Covenant basically merge in the collective memory later. At a certain moment, it's robbed into a single object. So here we see a 17th century engraving of the temple of the Holy of Holies, where we still have the two large cherubim, which would be the original ones. But then you see also the Ark of the Covenant, which now has taken two miniature versions of it. So in the original descriptions, the Ark of the Covenant did not have the cherubim. They come in later into the story. So now Judahite and Jerusalemite tradition have merged. In 721, Assyria, which is the dominant power, basically conquers Israel. So the tribes of Israel, the famous 10 tribes as they're remembered, are now sent into exile, and they disappear. They disappear because they are deported without any tradition to support them. Judea makes a deal with Assyria. And one of the problems, however, that they face is that the Assyrians sent in parties, raiding parties into Judea to get human beings. The Assyrians need labor. They need slave labor continuously. So what happens in Judea right now is that the king of Judea, Hezekiah, needs to be able to basically protect his people. He needs the people too. And so there's a rapid urbanization happening at the time in Judea. Jerusalem triples in size within a decade. And this is a result, so it basically now the whole economy becomes literally a single urban economy. The part of the policy, part of the problem that Hezekiah faces in this evacuation of the population into the cities to protect, quote unquote, protect them, a little bit like the protected villages the Americans created during the Vietnam War, they're in some way even concentration camps, is that he needs to sever the link of the peasants to the land. And this is created by a policy of destroying the high places, it's called, the local altars, the local sanctuaries. That is literally even destroying cemeteries as far as I'm concerned, yeah? So that means you basically make the rural population into a refugee population and then send them into the cities. Now, what happens is that there is a group of, there were three priestly groups in the time of Solomon. The Jerusalem priests were called the descendants of Zadok, Zadokites. The Judahite descended from Aaron, the Aaronites, and the Israelite had the Levites, who basically are the family of Moses. So what happens is that Levites had continued after the unification of the kingdom under David. They had also started to administer sanctuaries in the whole of the United Kingdom. When the two countries, Judah and Israel, are separated again, there are still Levites administering the sanctuaries both in Jerusalem and elsewhere in Judah. So when the Assyrians conquer Israel and deport the population into the depths of, basically the Mesopotamia, Levite priests basically move to Jerusalem because their cousins are there. They're working still. And they find a refuge in Jerusalem. And there's quite a conflict at that time of what their status will be of these refugee Israelite Levite priests. At this time, we basically get the creation of a whole narrative in the Bible, the book of P, the strand of P, which is about the idea that originally these Hebrew tribes had been together in the desert for 40 years, that they had collectively made an exodus from Egypt, and that there had been a cult in the desert, a shared cult in the desert that basically focused on a portable sanctuary. And here we have then a picture of the Hebrews, moving through the desert as an armed group. We see then the Ark of the Covenant right to the right, with these Levite priests accompanying it. And so at this time, it is the Levites in Jerusalem, the refugees who've arrived there, who basically create a narrative of this utopia that had existed in the temple, in the desert, basically a society that was not connected anymore to a sacred place. And that is a radical departure from anything that ever has been thought about in religion before. That this camp could be anything, that they had a portable sanctuary that could be put up and demounted again, and that wherever that sanctuary was pitched, God would be, which also basically, of course, is based on an idea that God is universal. So what we see here now is a dovetailing of this narrative that the Levites create with the policy of King Hezekiah to destroy the holy places. Yeah, holy places don't matter anymore. It's now a completely new relationship between place and between presence. So we have here the first utopia, non-place. Basically, that is what the camp of the Hebrews is in the desert. And this, of course, is an incredible, powerful tool for identity now, because when the tribes of Israel were deported by the Assyrians, they disappear. When in 597 the Babylonians come and conquer Jerusalem and deport the Judahites, they don't disappear. And the reason I believe they don't disappear is because they had this story. So this utopia then includes this incredible detailed description of a sanctuary. And this is the portable sanctuary, the tent, that it's not only a tent, it's actually a box if you read it very carefully. It's based on posts, and then it has a tent covering with all of the pieces. This is the oldest detailed description of a building, very detailed description, because now in some way the architecture matters and not the place anymore. So there is basically a move literally from the presence of God into a certain location to the presence of God into design. Also, what we get now is a new movement, is that, and of course, this utopia is based on the existing Temple of Jerusalem. It is explained as its original example, but in fact, it is a copy at a reduced site, and it merges very nicely the idea of the tradition of the tent of meeting, which is a Levite sanctuary originally, because it becomes a tent again, with, of course, that of the design of the temple in Jerusalem and the Ark of the Covenant, which is now its single important holy relic. So the three traditions are now reinterpreted in this portable sanctuary. One of the other things is that there is now a shift in the perspective from center, some centripetal kind of moving towards the center, which is traditional in the Middle Eastern tradition, Sumeria, Egypt, whatever like that, to the periphery. So with this, in this book, we also get all of these rules about how to separate basically this people from the rest of the world, how to make it holy. So the whole worldview is inverted in a sense. Yeah, instead of everyone looking at the center, everyone looking at the periphery, of the periphery, what is forbidden, what is permitted, the boundary that exists between this people and the rest of the world. Yeah, which in some way, of course, also creates a kind of insurance when you get lost. So the core of that is the 10 commandments, the thou shalt and thou shalt nots, which are part of this story. Another major shift is that now the traditional focus on place, holiness of place, shifts to a holiness in time. That the narrative that is created about the creation, the first chapter of Genesis, is all about, 6 days of work, the 7th day is holy. The idea of the legislation in Leviticus and Numbers, which is all about, the Shabbat. It's about the 6th day. It's about the 7th year. It is about the 49th, the 50th year, the Jubilee year. This idea that time basically is the instrument through which God orders the world. It is not space anymore. And this becomes really central now to the Jewish tradition that follows. 612, so this tradition has now merged into, let's call it, the Judahite consciousness. Then Assyria collapses, and the Judahites make use of the power vacuum that exists. And of course, you should always realize they're sitting between whatever to the north of them, which is, either Sumeria or Assyria or Babylon, and Egypt to the south, to expand into the north, into the old area that had been Israel. So, but now it is a single Judahite kingdom that basically appears to be a restoration of the United Kingdom of David and Solomon. It's ruled by a king, Josiah. And what's happening now, that there is another reinterpretation of the history of this people, which now focuses on the royal house. That is, Josiah is a descendant of David. This is now all about the house of David, the special covenant of God with David. So guess what? A priest goes into the temple, goes into the Holy of Holies, and they find a book to support their case. This is actually the book of Deuteronomy. And the book of Deuteronomy, the second law, nomos is law, deuter is second, the second law. And this book focuses on a covenant between David and God. It's not about the people as a whole, but between the house of David. But what's very interesting in this book is that it is conditional. It is conditional on the good behavior of both the king and of the people. So this is read to the people. And what we get now in insertions into the story that exists in another book, the Book of Kings, and later the Book of Chronicles, of the dedication of the temple by Solomon, suddenly language is inserted there, which talk about, first of all, the conditionality of the covenant, and second of all, that God actually doesn't live in the temple, that God is universal. So this is what Solomon says, but will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heavens, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built? Yeah. And then basically it spells out that idea that if the people fall away from God, God will not be with them. This is not a sentiment that Solomon would have understood. Yeah. But this is very much something that is possible in the wake of in the wake of Hezekiah's reform and the Levite rewriting of the early history. Which means that when in 597 the Babylonians come, they have filled up now the space. Yeah, they had first defeated the Assyrians, now they go after Judea. When they come and basically they conquer Jerusalem and they destroy the temple and take now the majority of the Judahites to Babylon as exiles, those Judahites actually have a framework of explanation what happened to them. First of all, the covenant, basically, they had broken their side of the covenant, which means that God is punishing them, yeah, which means that if they restore the covenant, they might come back. Second of all, God will be with them wherever. They're just returning to the desert, metaphorically speaking. So this is why they don't disappear. I call it the ideological life raft that had been created in P and D, in these two narrative strands of the Bible. In Babylon, of course, there are a big ziggurat in Itaminanki. They get ample opportunity to dislike their slaves there. So this is the story of the Tower of Babel, basically is written at this time. But also what we get is, for the first time, we get prophets now. There were prophets before, but an important prophet who comes in Babylon, you know, in some way saying, if you are going to be loyal to God, there will be a better future. This is Ezekiel. And very importantly, Ezekiel describes a new temple that will be built when the people are faithful to God at some future date. This temple is now, again, a permanent building, like the Temple of Jerusalem, but it takes in many of the aspects of the tabernacle in the desert. That it is a monumentalized version of the tabernacle that has to do with the relationship of the holy place and the Holy of Holies, for example. It's in the precision of the geometry. It's in the importance of boundary. Design is now more important than place. In some way, this temple could be built anywhere. And this is a 16th, 17th century German reconstruction of the Temple of Ezekiel. So it is very interesting to read this text and then to compare it to the tradition of the Temple of Jerusalem as built in Kings. It's actually much closer to the story of the tabernacle in the desert. Now, in the meantime, the Jews are in Babylon, but when the Persians come and basically defeat the Babylonians, the Judahite exiles, and now we may call them Jews, yeah, so this is the Sprachregelung we have here. Many stay in Babylon because now they're set free, but a minority returns to Jerusalem. And of course, those who stay, this is the beginning of the Jewish diaspora. Properly speaking, the group that returns to Jerusalem, which is seen as a kind of picking up of the journey of Abraham, or Abraham from Ur to Canaan. But it's very interesting, they start rebuilding Jerusalem, but they do not rebuild the temple immediately. It takes a whole generation. And why are they not immediately rebuilding the temple? Because they really don't need it. I mean, the temple really has no currency anymore in the way religion has developed. So it is only after a generation that they built a temple, and it's certainly not as splendid, at least as we know. It's a relatively simple building as the Temple of Solomon was. But another development happens at this time, which is much more important. That is that a man is there called Ezra. He's a scribe, and he brings together now E, J, P, and D, the four narrative strands of the Bible, into the Torah. So the Torah, we assume, is basically, he was the editor who brings all of these texts together. And we then know that he reads the Torah, this new document, publicly in Jerusalem. And so now what we get is a new idea of religion, which is text-based now. It is not that in some way the separation from the holy place is complete. And so we are now getting, so a temple will be built, and then Herod rebuilds it again. But in some way, the temple is an afterthought right now. Even the lady does protest too much in the case of Herod's temple, which was the largest single structure in the Roman Empire, by the way, when it was completed. Yeah, but in some way, the real focus of religion is now text-based. Yeah, it's not anymore holy place placed. And what the Torah does is that sanctity is invested in time. It's all about generations. It's about the life of this people, of the Hebrews, the Judahites, Israelites, and the Jews over time. So this then is also expressed, and here we have the Nuremberg Chronicles, you know, again in that first chapter of Genesis, that what is sacred in Genesis is not a place, but the seventh day, this day of perfection, the day of rest, you know, when God basically says the world is good. So now holiness is related to time and not to place. So then the Romans come along and they destroy the temple in 70 CE, take the stuff to Rome. Here we have the sculpture in the Arch of Titus in Rome. And again, it doesn't matter. In fact, it is the best thing that ever happened to Judaism. Because the temple had really become like a ball and chain for this people by the time the Romans came to come. And this is also very clear that in 70, just before Jerusalem is conquered, a leading rabbi or leading sage goes to Vespasian and says, you know, I don't need these temples and things like that. Give me the village of Yavne, which is close to Ashdod. I'm going to sit there with a few scholars and will continue Judaism. Yeah, what you need is the text. So this is part one of my story, and I don't know if you want to respond to that at this moment, but I can go into part two, which then looks at what happens after this very important caesura.
I think if there are any kind of immediate or pressing questions, it would be good if they're voiced. Otherwise, I would say that we should move on to the second part.
Thank you so much. It's really amazing, amazing information, amazing presentation of all of that in just in such a short time. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you. Okay, part two. So, synagogue, text, and home. So what had happened already before, in the 200 years before the destruction of the Second Temple, so around 200 BCE, a new institution had developed. It's called a synagogue, which means Beit Knesset in Hebrew, house of assembly, or synagogue, which is the literal translation in Greek. Assembly, of course, Greek was, this was Hellenistic times. Greek was basically the language of polite people. And this is, by the way, first of all, very important. This is a secular institution. It's not a sacred institution. It's a house of assembly. And this becomes a place where, in some way, people assemble to read the Torah. So this is the remains of the synagogue in Sardis. They're all over the Hellenistic world originally, later the Roman Empire. The oldest one in Rome is in Ostia. It's still there. And this literally are places of assembly. And so first of all, not a sacred place. It's not a successor of the temple. And the interesting thing is that if you look at the location, so the location you see Palestra to the right, it's actually in the bathhouse of the city of Sardis. Now the bathhouse, of course, in the Roman world or in the Hellenistic world, but especially the Roman world, were, you know, multi-purpose buildings. The first multi-purpose buildings, they contained libraries, they contained bathhouses, they contained clubs and so on. So the synagogue also can be there. There's nothing wrong of it being in such a, you know, overtly kind of secular place of pleasure and entertainment. So here we have the plan of it. And what is very interesting for me is the location of the arcs of the Torah. So to the right, we have the entry, yeah, the door, and you have the blue arrow coming in. You would expect in a traditional liturgical progression, you would expect that there is a progression to the most sacred part from the door, which we see later in the Christian tradition. However, the ark is actually sitting right next to the door. It's stored right next to the door. Yeah, we have on the apse on the other side, we have a place for the elders. And of course, elders are very important in any tradition that thinks in terms of generations. So it's actually the people, yeah, the wise men who are here to focus when you enter this place. It is not the holy text. The holy text is brought from the entrance where they are stored to the table where they're read, which is in green. I mean, this is a conjectural place during the service, and they're brought back then to the door. So in some way, strangely enough, the ark functions in some way, the Torahs are actually treated as if they are people themselves. And, you know, when you are actually in a synagogue and you have the honor of carrying the ark, and then at a certain moment sitting with the ark at the bima while other prayers are happening, it's actually very physical. It's a human being. It is it's as a book, you know, it is like a body. It actually is in some way body-sized when it is closed. So the important thing is that this synagogue already shows a kind of counterintuitive in the way the sacred is permanently located in this building. In fact, it is permanently located at the least important place. It's only brought to the place where at a certain moment its sanctity is celebrated during the service, and it will be brought back to its storage cabinet after the thing is read, which means it's again a process in time, and it's not the place itself that is glorified. We have synagogues. This is Dura Europos, which is in today's Syria, that will have decorations. This is the most famous set of decorations. We have here the place where the Ark, where the Torah is only stored during the service itself. It was stored outside of the space when there was no service. What we have here is then also that the niche where the Ark would be temporarily kept before it's read has images of the temple. It has images also of the attempted sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham, the central piece of Israel's faith with God and vice versa. But it's not a remaking of the temple. Very important is that to the right for us, to the right of this niche, we actually have a picture of Ezra reading the Torah. So again, it is in some way anchored in that history. There are references in this case to the tabernacle. There's also another mural of the temple, but they are only seen as related in time to this. Again, there is no attempt to argue that this is the new temple. And this is one of the reasons that synagogues are not allowed to actually have a menorah in the synagogue. You can have an 8-branched candlestick, which is menorah-like. That's for Hanukkah, but you cannot actually have the menorah because that would suggest that the synagogue is actually the new temple. Now, many liberal and reform communities get this wrong, but they get many things wrong, and many things also very right. So this is very different from the church type. The church type, as it develops in the Christian tradition in the 4th century, they create a very clear relationship of a progress to a holy place. So here we have a Piranesi of the San Paolo outside of the walls. It's looking, of course, at Piranesi's kind of perspective from the door, and you go towards the altar. This is the idea, and we find it in the Catholic traditions, the Protestants, the Orthodox traditions, in which there is an idea that in some way the church building is the new temple. And this comes out of the ideology of Christ as being the new temple. And this goes back to not only Christ cleansing the temple, but also Christ at a certain moment saying that, the temple made by human hands, where I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another not made with hands, which is from the Gospel of John, which is clearly a statement after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, but where it makes a claim that the resurrected body of Christ, that is the ecclesia, the community, is the new temple. Yeah, and this is central to Christian ideology. Yeah, so this is very different from the synagogue. The synagogue is not the new temple. The synagogue is just like a bathhouse. It's a place where people meet for reading Torah or for washing your body in the bathhouse case. But the Christians see their church building as actually a realization of Ezekiel's vision. Yeah, so they are the new temple. And also in many of the aspects of, for example, Christian ritual, for example, the Eucharist. The Eucharist is the sacrifice. It is, of course, in memory of the sacrifice of Christ, but the sacrifice of the Lamb on the altar of Holocaust in the temple. So we have a reinstitution of the sacrifice in the Eucharist. Yeah. And also the cult of relics is very important in the churches, because the cult of relics ties the altar back to a place of origin. The altar always contains in the Catholic tradition, I don't know the Orthodox tradition, but I guess the same, a relic. And a relic is a point of authenticity. It is like the Eben Shatia, a foundation stone. Again, that makes it into a holy place. permanently. There's also another important difference. In the Jewish tradition, you are born as a Jew. You're a Jew because your mother was Jewish. Yeah, doesn't matter if you believe anything of it. You do not have to have faith. There is no Jewish faith, really. Yeah. So the synagogue is a place where people meet who are not transformed when they come into the synagogue. They are as much a Jew when they're not in the synagogue, if they've never been in the synagogue, as when they're in the synagogue. However, the ideology of the church building is that, of course, the sacraments, and now I talk particularly about the sacraments in the Catholic tradition, the Protestant has fewer, the sacraments are instruments of transformation. They're sacred. Something happens that changes you through baptism, through confirmation, through confession, etc., through the Eucharist. Each time, you know, in public radio in the United States, NPR, people who didn't pay their annual fees, they say they are in lapsed land. Yeah, people, Christians, the assumption of Christian life is that you start out as a non-Christian, you're baptized into Christianity, you're confirmed when you're, you know, conscious, and then you constantly lapse back, and every time you go back in the church, you have an opportunity to regain the position you take, and you hope that you're not lapsed the moment you die. That's why you have the final sacraments of the dead. So this is this constant dynamic of falling back and moving forwards in the church you don't have in the synagogue. So this is also why the church is known, and this is the Santa Maria Maggiore, according to Piranesi, as the Hira Hodos, the holy road, from darkness to light, from the west to the east, from perdition to salvation, from the profane to the sacred. So the church is a place of great transformation. The synagogue is not. The same also in the Protestant churches. Here, a medieval Catholic church, which is adopted for Protestant use, and now the pulpit, the scripture, the reading of scripture, the word of God, is that point of transformation. Again, and the Bible itself in the Christian tradition is that epic now that goes from the fall of Adam, creation, the fall of Adam, yeah, which is then ultimately the fall of Adam is the fall of the whole of humankind, to the redemption of humankind prophesied at the end of the book of St. John, and in the Apocalypse with the sacrifice and resurrection of Christ, the new Adam sitting at the pivot. Again, it is about this very dramatic story of transformations. The church itself then is that house, that home of that redemption that sits between Christ's resurrection and the end of times in a hostile world. Here we have a depiction of the church from a medieval manuscript, and the church needs discipline. It's a fortress, yeah, and a fortress, the soldiers need discipline. So they have dogma in the church, and they also have a creed. And the creed, of course, basically is the, you know, basically your instructions. Yeah, I believe in it, whatever. And then you get fights about what is the right creed, and that's why you have the Orthodox and the Catholics and so on. Everyone starts disagreeing on it, but that's key to the Christian tradition. In the Jews, there's nothing. In the Jewish tradition, there's nothing like that. You have the one confession of the Jews, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. But apart from that, there is no creed, and there is in fact no theology. Jewish theology is a contradiction in terms. Yeah, you can say in the Kabbalistic tradition there are speculations in the mystical tradition about the nature of God, but not in the regular. The Talmud doesn't talk about it. The Talmud, the most important text of rabbinical Judaism that's created after the expulsion from the Holy Land, after the destruction of the Second Temple, it's a debate. It's a continuous debate about what to do. And this is the important thing. It's really a library, yeah? And it is basically a library of commentary on the oral traditions of the oral Torah. That is a oral tradition that Moses would have given to the people. So Judaism never talks about faith. It talks about, the central thing is something called halakha, which is the way of walking. So it's about behavior. Not what should I believe is the question, which is always in Christianity, but what should I do next? That is the key thing in Judaism, and that's what the Talmud is about. So then you get all of these opinions. There are all of these different opinions that are put side by side without actually any conclusion. So if we're looking now at the page of the Talmud, this is how a page looks like. And it looks like a labyrinth. So all of these different texts, even in different typefaces, right next to each other. And so if you're looking really at the city plan in some way, or if you don't know how to negotiate it, a labyrinth. And so there are the commentaries, and there are super commentaries and commentaries on the commentaries, and so on. And in a sense, while this is at a certain moment, as you get it, it's closed, people continue to add commentaries. So if you now look at this page, you see that we have the Mishnah on top, which is basically commentaries on the Oral Torah, the oldest one. We get the Gemara, which is a second level of commentaries. Then Rashi, very famous rabbi in the 11th century, he gets the place of honor on the right. This is, of course, also where Ezra was in the synagogue in Dura Aropos. Then we get basically the sons and the grandson, the Tosafists of Rashi, which then to the left, and continue and continue and continue. So what we have here is this sense of a very flexible, dynamic world, exactly the opposite of a creed, exactly the opposite of a creed. And it is all secular in a sense. It gives an enormous amount of space for disagreement, yeah? And disagreement is fine in this tradition, yeah? It's about the debate, yeah? And there's a very famous story, I just want to go back. There's a debate between the three Talmudic sages, and one says, if I am right, God will support my argument, and the north wall of the synagogue will bend in. And guess what? The north wall of the synagogue bends in. And the other Talmudic sage says, but I am right, and if God supports my argument, the south wall of the Talmud of the synagogue will bend in, and the south wall of the synagogue bends in. And the third one says, of course, I am right. If God support me, the east wall will bend in, and the east wall bends in. And so the angels are sitting up in heaven, and they're looking at God, and they're seeing this, and ask God, what are you doing here? I mean, it's all very confusing. And God said, I'm just having a little bit of fun. And so they have fun. Yeah, this is in some way what this page represents. So the problem for the Christians with the Talmud is that the Christian theology is based on the assumption that Judaism came to an end with the destruction of the temple, that Christ is the champion of the new covenant. We have the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, and the New Covenant. So once Christ is there, the only things that the Jew have to do is to recognize that Christ is the embodiment of the New Covenant, but they have no other function anymore in history. Yeah, they are the rejects in a sense. So this is depicted in this image of this church to the left, triumphant, synagogue defeated to the right, which actually is in the Basel Art Museum. Now, the problem for the Christians was that they basically interpreted Judaism as this state was frozen. They believed the Pharisees and whatever like that, that's what Judaism is like. Christ has really blown them out of the water, requiescing in pacem, Judaism, rest in peace. But of course, the rabbinical tradition, the Talmudic tradition that developed, in some way suggested that the Jews were not dead, that in fact Jewish religion continued and really changed very much at the time. So the result of that was that in some way the existence of the rabbinical tradition, and especially the very existence of the Talmud, became for the Christians a challenge they had to address. And this leads then to the first book burnings. Yeah, the Talmud always started out as a codex, yeah, not as a scroll. It always had this form as a codex. And they start in the Middle Ages basically burning the Talmud because, in fact, the very existence of the Talmud, the idea that history continues, Judaism continues, is intolerable. So here we have now a Stolperstein. They are being created for human beings in Germany, but here we have one in Rome at where Giordano Bruno was burned at the Forum de Fiori, which now also remembers the burning of the Talmud. In fact, the Talmud, and the Talmud, quote unquote, Jew, as it's called, becomes a obsession of anti-Judaism and later anti-Semitism. Here we have the synagogue in Prague, and of course it looks pretty sinister in this picture created by a Czech artist, Rehling, in the 1920s, artist, quote unquote. And you see this specter coming up, this evil spirit, and it's called Talmud. And from this synagogue now, yeah, basically the evil of the Talmud is invading the world. And one of the reasons for that is the idea that which Alfred Rosenberg, the ideologist of the Nazi Party, articulates very clearly, that the Talmud basically says that the morality Jews have amongst themselves is not the same as they have in relationship to other people. That the Jews seem to be all very ethical and moral when they deal with each other, but in relationship to the world outside, they can do anything. They are obliged to murder Christians and so on. So the Talmud becomes in there, and of course they don't understand it because it's a very elaborate thing. It's not, they interpret a sentence in there as if it's a creed instead of a fragment of a big discussion. This is the interior of that same synagogue, the Altneuschule. And what you see here is something very interesting where we go to the architecture of the medieval synagogue, both in Central Europe and also at the same time in Eastern Europe. I'm talking now about the Pale of Settlements, so that is Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. And that is that the center is occupied. So if the Christian church is always about the Hierohodos, the Holy Road, from perdition to salvation, in the synagogue, the center is actually occupied. And there is a centrifugal kind of movement around the center. And if you're looking carefully at the way these people are sitting and debating and so on, this is basically a number of tiny little discussion groups, so to speak, or prayer groups, who are gathered in this building. This is not like a phalanx of an army, which is the Christian idea of everyone, you know, going as this army towards redemption. This is a Freudian slip when I wanted to say almost perdition. So it is very important, this print is very important to understand the fundamental speciality of the synagogue as it develops in Europe. So we saw Sardis before, yeah, but it is one of chaos. And so in German, there is this term, Judenschule. Of course, the term in German, Schul, comes from Schule, from school. So again, it is a secular building, essentially. Then they call it a Jewish school, Judenschule. But as a metaphor, it means synagogue, but also a disorderly crowd, a chaos. You know, so when you have a meeting and you call it a Judenschule, yeah, it means basically there's no order there. Outsiders cannot see the order in, let's say, a synagogue gathering. It's impossible. So if we, but the idea also is that what seems to be the same, like a sermon, if a sermon is ever given, it's not really the same as a sermon in the Christian tradition. It's not a point of transformation. People already are what they are before they enter the synagogue. So here we have the synagogue in Wandshut, which is in Poland. And here we come to the typical East European model of the synagogue. And this was, of course, the great synagogue in Lviv or Lvov or Lemberg, which isn't there anymore, but it exists as a place now, as a square. And its base, its outlines have been restored. But this is the type, this is really the synagogue, which in some way, I think, codifies this Jewish idea of what this place is. It is a centrifugal place. It is a place, and you see now the relationship to my original diagram. Yeah, you see actually the center is occupied by something. The center is not a road. There is no axial relationship in the synagogue. So when we get 19th century synagogues built in Germany, especially in the liberal Reform tradition, that try to create a central axis imitating a Christian idea of what a church building that is a synagogue is a Jewish church, they get it completely wrong. You know, the authentically Jewish tradition of what synagogue space is like really was preserved in the East. And you see again here, there is this sense of a non-hierarchical space. centrifugal. So if we look now at this typical service, and now take the plan of the synagogue in Vilna, you see that in most of the service, when somebody comes in and the person is German, he will say, this is a Judenschule, yeah, this is a chaos. There are actually simultaneously, you would be able to, there are many different things going on, even during the service itself, for most of the time of the service. Services are long, there are prayers, and you will have, you know, and I've indicated, you know, symbolically here different groups. Yeah, we have the women galleries to the right and to the top, and then we have a number of groups sitting around that center, and each will have their own particular focus, and there's another focus going on in the bima. But then what happens is that at certain moments in the service, in some way, everyone or almost everyone will pay attention. I have one group here, maybe these are the kids right now who are not paying attention in pink, but everyone will for a moment, for example, saying of the Kaddish, when the ark was opened for the Torah to be taken out and to be brought to the bima and so on, there are certain moments when everyone is for a moment focused. And then after that, the ordinary kind of chaos returns into the synagogue service. That is normal, that's not an aberration. It is an aberration when you get a German reform service on Oranienburger Straße, where everyone is paying attention to what's happening in the front all the time. That is an aberration, a total aberration of what a synagogue really is like. Now, it makes Germans very comfortable because they're an anal people, with all respect to Ines Weitzman. So we get the German jury, of course, has created its Christian version of synagogues, but this is not how it's supposed to be. And this, of course, also to remember, there's no priesthood anymore. Since the destruction of the temple, people are born in the priesthood, Jewish men, some of them the Kohanim, but they're not practically priests except for one ceremony on the Day of Atonement. In a sense, it's a completely flat, there's no hierarchy, it's completely flat. The rabbi is not a priest, the cantor is not a priest. In some way, again, that makes that chaotic, that seemingly chaotic, kind of flat kind of hierarchy in the service possible. Always, of course, being a horizon of another space, again, centrifugal. Always there is the memory, of course, of the Holy Land, of the land of origin and the land of return. One thing I just want to point out, many synagogues would always have a bath, and there we get again the sense of the descent, the mikveh, very important. In the Jewish tradition, Orthodox women will go to the mikveh after they had the menstrual cycle before they will again have intimate relationship with their husbands. And this can go very deep because they actually, that can only be happen in the groundwater. So this is in Friedberg, in the Harz Mountains. So you have to go down 20 meters. Yeah? You cannot carry the water up to a bathtub. So again, a very interesting piece of in this case, a piece of the architecture of the synagogue, I just wanted to call on. If the synagogue is secular, in the Jewish tradition, the house is sacred. And that is where you again have to really, and that is, or it's more sacred. And that has to do, first of all, with what Jewish religion is about. It's not about redemption in heaven, it's about kids. It's about creating a big people. That's what God promises Abraham. So it's about generations. Yeah. So the house, of course, is the place where that is done, where the new generation is created, is raised, where the generations are together. So what you have is at the threshold of the house, you have this mezuzah, which basically is an amulet almost. And that basically is and you touch it when you go in and you go out. And this basically is about, it has the one line creed that God is one, and it's about the covenant, that you have to love God, and that, and it basically doesn't say go to synagogue or anything like that, yeah? It doesn't say anything about it, but it said write this on the door frames of your houses and your gates, yeah? So the house is in a strangely sense made sacred. Also, its sanctity is actually emphasized by the fact that Jews 7 days in the year live in a non-house. That is, that they have this Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Booths or Sukkot, when you move outside of the house and you live in a little shelter. in memory of the time in the desert. And so that in some way, by creating a ritual in which you're kicked out of your house for 7 days and then return to it, and all of the important things in the house are in that week done into that temporary shelter, again emphasizes the importance of the house. The house becomes basically, it is ideologized in a sense. So it is I think very important in understanding the Jewish home. The third thing is, of course, that the most important festival, historical festival, is celebrated in the house. That the most important ritual that Jews have is the Passover meal, which is a ritual of all generations coming together, in which the youngest generation has a very important role by asking the key questions. And it is a homebound ritual. It's not a synagogue-bound ritual. Yeah, and this is in memory of the Exodus from Egypt. So it also is very interestingly that it places itself, the ritual, in relationship to the ordinary. Why is this night different? Normally we do this, now we do that. And normally we do this, now we do that. So it places the most sacred moment in the Jewish year in terms of its own history, and you can debate in relationship to Day of Atonement, in relationship to the ordinary life in the house. Then there is the importance of the house becomes very clear when we think about how the most holy day in the year, more important than in fact the Day of Atonement, which is a Shabbat, which returns every week. God blesses says the Shabbat is sacred. He doesn't talk about the Day of Atonement in Genesis. That because Jewish days begin when the sun sets, this is actually not when you're in the synagogue. This is when you're at home. The ritual that welcomes the Shabbat and the ritual that ends the Shabbat are homebound rituals. So here we have the blessing of the Shabbat lights by the wife. Clearly, the husband is looking at the clock. Yeah. So this is also this idea that every week there's another time that you begin. So you built up that sense of anticipation, all homebound. And then into the house, the Shabbat is welcomed like a princess bride. Yeah? Again, stressing the importance. And then the Shabbat itself becomes what Abraham Joshua Heschel calls, it becomes a cathedral in time. It is the perfect rest. I mean, the Shabbat is really fulfilled in a day of rest at home. Again, creating a sense of home that really doesn't exist in any other civilization as far as I know. And it is the celebration of completion, of perfection. Synagogue never claims anything like that. So the home during Shabbat is in some way time fulfilled. This is also the day that you talk about the ancestors, those who have died. So quite often Jewish cemeteries look a little forlorn. That's not important, unlike in the Christian tradition where you go out and you maintain the graves and bring flowers and, like yesterday on the day of the All Saints and All Souls and so on. The Jewish tradition, that's not important because in fact, the dead are present on Shabbat. So, one of the other indications of the central importance of the house is that on Shabbat, in many communities, the house extends to actually include the whole community. That means that the private, because you cannot carry anything out of the house because of the Shabbat rules, you basically are to, you have a Talmudic discussion, many Talmudic discussion. Oh God, I need to kill this. Wait for a moment. Okay, so we got back into this. I'm sorry for this. How do I do this? I'm going back. So one of the important things here is actually the fact that the boundaries of the house start extending until it encompasses the whole community. This is the Iruf, Yeah, this idea of originally the walls of the ghetto, mixture. The term mixture comes from the mixing of food. And here we have the roof of Odessa around 1894. This idea that all the households come together in a single household by bringing food together in one place. And so that the house encompasses the whole community, the private encompasses the public never intrudes into the private, which also shows you the dominance of the house over the public. Yeah. So normally you can say that in many traditions, the public will, sorry for the verb, trump the private. In the Jewish tradition, exactly the opposite. The house is more important than the synagogue. The synagogue is taken up on Shabbat through the eruv into the private domain of the house. And then finally, we have the Havdalah ceremony. The Havdalah ceremony, that is the end of the day, the end of Shabbat. It's again celebrated in the house itself. And what we have there is, everyone has some wine, a candle is lighted, and then most important is that there is this object, a spice box, which quite often actually has the architecture of a castle. And this is, you smell the sweet spices, which reminds you of Shabbat as you go into the new week, and you need strength for that. Hence, it is a little castle, and it's of course a hostile world in which you go, which then leads to part number 3, the road to Bабin Yaru. So I think that this right now, in some ways, summarizes, I would say, the first 2 parts of my talk. I have another 10 minutes at most, which basically deals with the principles of Jewish space. And then ultimately the 3rd part really deals with the the modern condition, with the way modern anti-Semitism basically started to warp this, and then basically the space of the Holocaust, which I'm discussing, and then how we, after the Holocaust, try to cope with that. That's what I had to say today.
Okay. Thank you so much, Robert Yain. Thank you. Maybe we can actually have you present this part 3 on another time. I think it would be very valuable. But yeah, I mean, now that you just have, we know you need to leave in just a couple minutes. And, so I want to open the floor for discussion, but maybe I can just ask one question, which is a very speculative one. And I'm not sure that you would feel comfortable giving an answer to this without having delivered part 3 of this lecture. But, from the place where we are today, speaking with the Babin Yaru Foundation, and with the idea to build a space of memorialization on the site of Babin Yaru in light of this history, I wonder kind of what your, whether any of these kind of typologies or reference points from this very, very rich history that you've drawn out, be it the synagogue or the tent of meeting, or any of these, I wonder kind of how you see the relationship between this long history and the present kind of moment. Is this space, is this material for us to actively interpret, or how do you see that?
First of all, as historians are bad prophets, and historians are mostly also very bad politicians. Yeah. That I think that what we need, that what ideally one would, what I hoped was to do with this, is to basically introduce a language and a few basic concepts that I believe and show their historical, their origin in history and in a dialectic that could help us, let's say if we were to create a brief. Yeah, that could actually help us to understand what some of the issues, what might be some of the issues we want to look at. Let's say that at a certain moment, for a moment, I'm just thinking up loud, that we're going to say that we need both at the site to acknowledge that many of the people who were murdered there were Orthodox, were Christians, and then many people were Jewish. And then I guess there were many Soviet citizens who probably would not dare to admit to any religion at the time. But okay, that when we start thinking about it, that in some way we need to realize that a gesture towards the Orthodox community and a gesture towards the Jewish community might actually take exact opposite forms. That would be at this moment the first thing. That when we talk about the synagogue, that when we talk about the essence of the synagogue being, let's say, a centrifugal space, a space where things happen in time, but they are not predetermined really in space. And that is what the synagogue does. It is during the service that for a moment everyone is pulled together, but normally it is a scattering of things. I think that we should not immediately start to think about creating a monument or a space that actually imposes a certain direction in space through its design. I think we should actually then have a confidence and a trust in the users to figure it out how and when there will be this shared focus, and how and when there will be the individualized kind of attention to whatever people want to pay attention to. I also think that we shouldn't be afraid for the secular thing. I mean, if synagogues can be in bathhouses, then I don't think that we should try to impose on this level of sanctity. Now, of course, we are at the site or close to the site of a terrible tragedy. But the last picture that I actually shows, and thank you, Anna, was this one. And I am not at all offended by this, not at all. I mean, I do believe that I mean, from a Jewish perspective, it's a place of generations. If we do not really believe in holy places, the question is, how do you continue? How is it that you can continue in that site with that history while creating a new generation that finds its proper place in the world? It's not to say that we clear the the volleyball courts, the makeshift or the picnic benches from a site like that. In fact, of course, cemeteries quite often are. Now the question is, if you're looking at how the Polish population in Auschwitz is dealing with their site, with Birkenau, it's a kind of a public park for the local population. So in that sense, I am drawing out of the tradition of Jewish space. I think the most important conclusion is not to get too tied up in knots about certain behavior patterns that need to apply to something all the time. I think it talks very much about a very flexible approach, I think. And and that's a much more situation. I mean, if anything is situationist in the early modern period, it's an East European synagogue. So in some way, if you can start thinking about the kind of rituals that we developed in the 60s and 70s, or the patterns of dealing actually with profound political, social, and even religious issue, from the situationist perspective, I think actually you get quite close to something that would have been recognized by the people who would have used those spaces. Mm-hmm. Now, I need to go. I really, they want me to log into the White City in Tel Aviv in 10 minutes, actually in 7 minutes, and I need to just eat something, if that's okay. So can we leave it with this for the moment? I mean, I'm still there, is that okay?
Thank you, Robert, so much. And it's a wonderful piece of research and a great pleasure to hear, and I looking forward for the third part, and we'll be happy to discuss those points you touched today at the last minutes before you leave.
Okay.
Thank you, Robert.
Okay, I will see some of you in Tel Aviv then in a moment. Ines, to see you in Tel Aviv. What a weird world. This is a centrifugal. Huh?
Okay, thank
you. See you soon. Bye.
Bye. Are we staying on?
No, I need to leave. I leave. Yeah. But I will see you there. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye.
On the left as well. Bye. Bye. Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah. That Marina also left, and
yeah.
Yes, everyone left.
Everyone.
Yeah.
Okay. So